Okay, Bismillah, Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah. Hello, everybody. This will be our fifth or sixth lecture in a row. Today we're going to talk about prosodic features, meter, and rhythm. And in the very first point, when we talk about prosodicity, okay, prosodicity usually means al-arud. And if the word al-arud is not that relevant for you in Arabic, you can search for it. But I posted the most simple the simplest and very basic definition for al-arud. Mainly, the most important point in prosody is concerned with the rhyme and the musicality of the verse. And if you remember, in the very earliest lectures, the first or the second lecture, we were talking about one of the most important features and characteristics of poetry, which is the musicality. Okay, and this is one of the most important points that distinguishes it from verse, other than the other than the the length and language and subject matter, that subjectivity. One of the most important things that distinguishes poetry from verse or verse from prose, okay, is the musicality of a poem or the musicality of verse. And usually poetry makes use of the musics, the sounds, or the musics, or the musicality of the sound itself, of the language itself. Inshallah, if you're going to study phonetics, or if you already studied phonetics, there are some features in the language, in the sounds. Okay, basically, when you study phonetics and phonology, you're studying the utterance, the speech, okay, or the production of speech, which is the ups and downs and vibrations of the sound. And and usually language contain some parts of stressed and stressed, aspirated and non-aspirated vowels and consonants, and long vowels and short vowels. Those vibrations, ups and downs, the fluctuation in the sound, okay, in any language denotes some features of the musicality. Usually, poetry makes use of such features in a language in order to obtain the musicality of a given verse. And when we talk about poetry and the prosody of poetry or the musicality of poetry, the early most important the early forms of poetry or the old poetry and medieval poetry used to follow some specific patterns, rules, or regulations when they wanted or when poets wanted to write poetry. But currently, such rules, regulations, such patterns are not followed. The thing that deviated poetry from following such patterns to a pattern that is called the free form verse that doesn't follow a specific pattern of prosody or musicality in while writing a poem. But usually, even at the when writers were or poets were writing poetry, such a pattern was even in the musicality were used to have a function. Like for example, when a poet wants to write a national poem or to promote nationalism or bravery, for example, or supposingly that a poet would write an epic or or write a poem in a serious subject. Supposedly, we want to talk about nationalism or for something for the national anthem. Even today, you can notice that the national anthem in your language has some features and follows and has some dominating sounds. And usually such sounds are the plosive sounds or الأصوات الانفجارية, okay, in order to add to the seriousness to the topic. And the ear itself, while listening to the poem, can be or adapt itself to the way or the subject matter or the seriousness of the subject matter. And when we talk about prophecy, one of the very first features of one of the very first things that comes into mind when we want to talk about poetry is meter. And when we talk about meter usually means الوزن الشعر. Uh, And in Arabic we have the wazn and we have بحور الشعر. And usually we have seven or عندنا سبع بحور رئيسية تستخدم كانوا الشعراء قدماء الشعراء يستخدموها. In English, we have three forms of meter that poets used to follow, and the fourth form is the free verse. The first one, uh, the first meter or the first pattern of meter poets used to follow is the accentual meter. And when we talk about this accentual meter, we mean that each line in a verse or each line in a poem has the same number of stresses in the following lines. Like each of the lines of the verses of a poem contain equal numbers of stresses. While you're following the accentual meter, the stresses in each line of verse of each line in the poem are equal, but the lines vary in the syllables that are used in each line. And we will talk about the stress for those who didn't take the course phonetics and phonology. Usually, we can take an example, a word like import, which is bringing goods from outside. Placing the stress on one part of or one syllable can change the meaning from being a verb to being a noun. Import or export and export. Placing the syllable in the first in the on the in the first syllable, sorry, placing the stress on the first syllable or the second syllable can change the meaning of the word from being a noun into being a verb. This is in brief what we mean by stress. The second type is the syllabic meter. And when we talk about, well, in the very first, in the first example or in the first form of meter, accentual meter, when we're talking about, we said that the accentual meter, they are consistent in the number of stresses, but lines or verses or the lines of a poem are consistent or equal in the number of stresses, but they vary in the number of syllables. But on the syllabic meter, lines of a poem or each verse, lines of a poem are equal in the number of syllables that are used in each line, but they vary, each line varies from the other line in the number of stresses. The third type of meter is the accentual syllabic meter, where each line or lines of a poem are equal in the number of the stressed syllables and the non-stressed syllables, and the order of such syllables, stressed and non-stressed, follow a specific pattern. The final form of meter we have, which is the most common currently, the modern one, which is the free verse, okay, where a poet do not or the poet does not follow a specific pattern of meter. Poets do not usually follow accentual syllabic or accentual syllabic meter. They usually base their poems on something we call the internal beat, and this will be left for the following lectures. Examples of such types of meter in modern English poetry cannot be easily found because such forms or such meters were followed in the Old English or the medieval English, and after that, poets started to follow a different way, which is the free verse. But during our practice, when we take poems to be analyzed and discussed, such things will be raised, and e- examples for such patterns will be discussed thoroughly. Generally speaking, when we talk about the prosody or the meter of a poem, as we said that when the poet wants to intentionally follow a specific meter while writing the poem, okay, usually the most common thing is that the poem chooses or the poem must be based on a meter that is consistent with the subject matter. Okay, just as with the example we were talking about the national anthem or the Nasheed al-Watan. Okay, usually in such topics, usually the most common sounds you will find there are the plosive sounds. The second point is that sometimes incoherence in the meter of a poem might indicate something. And in that context, during the Soviet and during the Cold War, one of the English poets wrote a poem that only consists of two words. The whole poem started like an chi an chi. In the very first lines, the poet was writing chi, the word chi, and the word an in a specific pattern. But after that, the word order started to change, and after that you cannot follow any pattern. Chi 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 and chi and chi. The whole poem goes in that way. And just to clarify that, An was a monkey, and Chi was a panda, and was in a zoo in the United States, and in England, and she was a panda in the Soviet Union. And during that time, there were some attempts to mediate and reconcile the Soviet Union and the United States of America. But after that, all of the attempts collapsed. And the poem goes like with the very early first attempts to reconcile the United States and the Soviet Union at that time, and chi and chi, like following things were going good. But when such efforts collapsed, the rhyme or the pattern or the meter or the prosody of the poem collapsed with such attempts. So this is an example when not following a specific meter in the poem can contribute an additional meaning to the poem. Secondly, the following point is mainly about the free verse, which is mainly started to be more common during the 20th century to the current moment, where when the free verse poets or the writers are not limiting themselves or abiding themselves to specific meter verses or lines of the poem. You cannot follow a specific pattern in the organization or the number of syllables, the stressed or the unstressed ones. But this does not mean that free verse does not hold or contain or possess its musicality. It has, but in another way, like in the words or the syntactic features of the of the words that are used. And just such examples, you will take such examples when you study modern literature in the following course or the course that comes after poetry too. Okay. Now, when we talk about the meter, the prosody and the meter, regardless the fact that so we said before that usually poems or poets when writing while writing a poem usually used to follow a specific pattern and metrical pattern, but sometimes it is common within the same poem you find some exceptions or a line, two, a couple of lines, three lines that do not follow the same pattern and the musical pattern or the meter of the poem. And usually such lines are do create some argument and debate and enrich the discussion and an analysis of a poem. But generally, instead of saying that a poem has two meters or two different meters or three different meters, it is more feasible, okay, as Roland Wells said, that usually in such a case there is a human tendency to generalize things. That is to say that what is important or what's supposed to be said here is that a poem follows a specific meter with some exceptions in some lines. This is what we call when looking into a poem and saying that a poem follows a specific meter and there are some exceptions. This the first part, which is a poem follows a specific meter or has some specific features or common features or dominating features in the poem. This is what we call the maximization principle. So to take the most important or the most common meter in the poem and make it as the rule. And other lines that do not follow this example or this meter are considered as exceptions. And usually, even in the lines itself, the lines of a poem that hold the same meter, and understanding or perceiving the same line or the same poem might differ from one reader to another. Now consider this example: nature in here, then earth, but not but forget. Usually, critics, when they were viewing this line, they had two different points in understanding or perceiving this line and measuring or studying the meter of this line. And they were usually debating or arguing about the stressed or the stressed parts of the words but, not, and but. Some of them were placing the stress or the personality was more usually placed on the word not, but others were placing it on ed and but. And this might the reason of this is that the is mainly can be mainly attributed to the fact that we talked about previously, which is the subjective nature of poem that mainly it reflects the subjectivity of the writer or subjective matter or reflection of the self. And such a reflection, after, even in common, most modern schools of literary criticism, for example, the reader response, for example, which is mainly based on the reader's attributions, the reader's perception of the text rather than seeking or looking for the meaning that was intended by the writer. Such attributes in perceiving, studying, and analyzing literature generally contributed to such variations. So, what I'm trying to say here, like, even when poetry, even when poets, or even when poems usually or follow a specific meta or specific matter, a pattern, sorry, in writing the poem, you will have some exceptions. In some lines, you will have some exceptions, and such exceptions do create a strong, enrich the discussion and analysis of such a poem. And while poets or poetry must be careful, poets must be careful, following with one of danger, one of the killing factors actually for a poem, which is like the which is what we call the routine of the or the over routine of the same pattern, and so usually such patterns are broken in order to break this routine and to avoid boredom. And usually poets, when they do so, they use the or they break the such a pattern in order to drag attention, because this is an important point. Now suppose that you are listening to a teacher, or you are listening to a preacher or khutbah, for example, that for 1 whole hour or half an hour, for example, is using the same beat, the same meter, up, down, up, down, up, down. Okay, stressed and stressed, stressed and stressed. Such a pattern will, by the course of time, you might attribute attention for in the very first 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, but after that, unintentionally, you will fall asleep and you'll get easily distracted. And in order to avoid that, usually when people or when good speakers want to deliver a speech, they do not follow a specific pattern. They might have a pattern, but the pattern usually is broken in order the the very like increasing the voice or heightening the voice very high and then dropping it and then for going back to the pattern and then increasing the voice or heightening the voice again and dropping it again, that there is something going on here. Even pauses can be used to drag attention, like for example when in al khutbah, in Friday khutbahs or preachers, usually you will find the sheikh beginning his preacher or khutbah with an introduction, and there's something common, like immediately after the introduction, they will say something like "وأما بعد." and أما بعد is followed by a pause. And here, this pause, unintentionally, you will start to think, what is the sheikh going to say? What is the subject matter? Such pauses sometimes can be used to break such meter or the prosody or the meter of a poem and in order to drag attention. Usually poets do so by following substitution or reaction. They use substitution to gain reaction and attention. And okay, so the two forms or the two ways into the two common ways in breaking the pattern or the musicality in order to avoid burden is substitution and recitation or recitation. And what we mean by substitution here is that the poet himself intentionally, while writing the poem, includes one, two, three, or four lines that do not follow the magical grid that we talked about, that do not follow the pattern of the whole poem. And such lines are rather considered as an exception, rather being or we usually say that the poem follows a specific meter or specific pattern rather than saying that the poem has two, three, or four patterns of meter. And when we say the second point about breaking such a pattern in order to avoid boredom, which is the citation. And here, in this part, the poet or the writer does not intervene. Rather, it is the one who is reading or reciting verse here, and mainly it is created by the one who is reading it. In a way, like the same thing that was explaining, like for example in al-khutbah, al-jam'ah khutbah, where the preacher or the speaker or the one who is reciting the poem, he himself is creating the ups and downs, stresses and stressing some parts and unstressing other parts and contributing, adding pauses in the while reciting, while reading the poem in order to drag attention, in order to drag attention. So the most important difference here is that the first, the one pattern substitution is intentionally done by the writer himself, and the writer is intentional and makes that this variation intentionally. And the second point is that it is done by the one who is reading or reciting the poem. Now, moving to the second point or the following point is the rhyme. And when we talk about rhyme, we don't have some specific this thing is stressed and unstressed or the number of syllables that we can call it the rhyme. The rhyme is this generally a more wide and general phenomenon that is based, it's not only based for poetry itself, but a language, each language, or usually languages do hold or do possess their own rhyme. And such a rhyme is mainly based on the build-up, release, movement, counter movement, ups and downs, stressed and unstressed. Such things that are the most important things that contribute to the prime building or الوزن. Okay, and to in order for the such variations in speech can be understood or can be perceived or listened or there are such features or such rhythmic features are mainly based on some factors as the pauses, the stops, that a poet or the one who is reciting it, like when a poet is intentionally wants to place a pose, they usually put three lines, or while printing it, they make a space in the place where the pose is supposed to be. The second point is the legends and expansions. Like, for example, one of the most important and plosive sounds can be used in legends. For in English, for example, is the sound p, or you generally speaking, are the plosive sounds, and how such the plosive or non-plosive sounds are used in addition to the expansions that are mainly used that are mainly used on vowels, and such a thing we will going to discuss, where usually and lengthening the sound is mainly placed with vowel sounds, not consonants. The use of consonant clusters, which is the sequence of consonant sounds in one syllable. And the last point here is the modulation or the adjustment or the modification that a poet himself or a writer might, or the one who's reciting or reading a poem might adjust or contribute in order to gain the needed attention and contribute additional musicality to the poem. Such features, such features are not the only one, but they are the most common and most important factors in contributing to the rhyme or constructing or building up the rhyme of a poem. Now, the following point is talking about the rhyme. And what we mean by the rhyme is that when we have two words that have the same sound, phoneme, from the last stressed vowel onwards, this is called a noun. Sorry, this is called a rhyme. And I think we had some examples in while analyzing the rhythmic features of the sonnet. And we have like something around nine nine types of rhymes, but basically we're going to talk about three types of rhymes here. The first one is the fully rhyme. The fully rhyme usually we refer to something called fully rhyme when we find that the last stressed syllable in two words are the same, okay, but the variation is in the preceding consonant that precedes the last stressed syllable. For example, when we have an example like chain and brain, ch, ch, b, b, brain. So the two words are rhyming in ain and ain in the ending parts of the ending syllable. Okay, and but the variation is in the first consonant that preceded the last stressed vowel. Okay, another example like night, night, and delight, la. Okay, the most important, the variation here is in the consonant that precedes b, ch, brain, and chain, night, and night, and and delight. The second form of rhyme here is rich rhyme, and when we were talking about the variation in the consonants and that precedes the vowel in fully rhyme. When rich rhyme, we're not talking about variation. We're talking about being identical or sameness, as in lap and clap, lap, l, lap, and clap. As you can see, that consonants L are the same in the two words. In the identical rhyme, there is like we have we have the word or the same word that can be used in the same way, like the same word is written two times and in the ending to make the rhyme, but in the two rhymes, in the two places, that the usage and the meaning of the word and the word differs. Like for example, if you might find the word we were talking about, export and export, one verb and one noun. This must contribute to the meaning, varying, differentiating the meaning. But the rhyme and the same thing is the same here. The second thing after the rhyme is alliteration, and what is something different than the used to definition or the thing that you studied in phonetics. But here is mainly when we talk about alliteration, is using the same sound consonant at the beginning of words or set syllables. Okay, and such uses and employment, it would be constant and so close, following each other in their proximity. And in order to facilitate the image or the meaning for you, just look at this example here and find the alliteration here, and this will be what we're going to talk about and discuss during our following lecture, Zoom lecture. The same thing that is applied here with consonant sounds can be applied or can be used with consonant sounds and alliteration. The same thing can be used here with assonance, which is mainly the repetition in close proximity, but not for consonants, for vowels. Okay, and we have an example here we're going to discuss during the Zoom meeting. And that's it for today. Hopefully you enjoyed your the lecture today, and we're going to have some further discussions on the Zoom meeting. After this lecture, we're going to talk about the figures of speech, inshallah, in the following lecture. Thank you.